It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Michele Rigby Assad, and we're going to be discussing her new book, Get Off the X, CIA Secrets for Conquering Obstacles and Achieving Your Life's Mission. Michele, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shaun. So happy to be here.
Well, truly my pleasure to speak with you today. I think the place I'd love to begin is just dig a little bit into your backstory, just to give the viewers and listeners context for you, who you are. So I was asked, share a little bit of your origin story, superpowers, special abilities. What's going to make you memorable to us?
Oh, yes. So I grew up in a very small town in Central Florida. Didn't know much about the world, but loved God and committed my life to Him at a very young age and didn't put any conditions on that. I basically said, wherever you want me, God, I will go. And He took me up on it. Never imagined where I would eventually end up, but I had a real sense of adventure, and the Lord opened doors starting right after high school on a mission trip to Egypt, which I had never had a passport. My family didn't travel. That was a very kind of crazy thing to do, right? A couple days after I graduated. And that was led by my future husband, Joseph, who grew up in Egypt and is a persecuted Christian, was kicked out of university for his faith. But anyway, this introduced me to this new place called the Middle East. And I kept getting abroad and studying abroad in Egypt and Israel. And we did a mission trip in Russia and Ukraine right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then eventually, the Lord led us into, of all places, the CIA to serve as a counterterrorism specialist right on the heels of 9/11, which, of course, was a very fascinating time to be a counterterrorism officer. And we ended up serving 10 years together, side by side, primarily in the Arab world, undercover. So in a nutshell, that's the origin story.
Well, that was great. I always say it should be like an elevator pitch link story. So you got us down like appropriately to the ground floor, and we're ready to just move on. That is always a dangerous thing. I love what you said, that, when you tell God, I'm willing to go wherever you want me to go, He'll usually take you up on that. So but I don't want to tell people, be careful if you pray about that or you say that, because I feel like it will spur you into something you never would have gone for, maybe something you never would have expected. So I guess the moral of that is just pray bold prayers and see where God takes you. In terms of being a Christian, serving in the Middle East, I'm sure that had to be fascinating, being in the Arab world as a Christian and also being undercover. Like, I'd love to hear just was that challenging? How did you work that out? It had to be memorable, to say the least.
Oh, my goodness. For sure. So I think that I'm so grateful that I had my husband, who's from Egypt, who could interpret for me the culture, because these are things you cannot read in a book, that you have to learn on the mean streets of Cairo. And I would say to my husband, like, why do people think this way, or why do they act this way? And so what he told me very early on is, as a Christian, somehow you've been taught that you need to hide your faith in the Middle East. But in fact, you will be respected more if you tell people that you are a Christian, a person of faith. So I did what Joseph suggested. I did that. It was very, very clear when I met government officials and business people in the Middle East and the places we served. And they were always shocked because they think all Americans are heathens who don't know God, don't care about God. So they take their worst ideas of what they see in the Hollywood movies. And so, but what I would be very clear about was like, I love God. I'm a dedicated Christian. And they'd look at you with like these eyes, like, really? But then they would respect you. And that is an interesting thing, I think, quite surprising to people.
Yeah, it is interesting that the perspective a lot of people have outside of the States is that we're heathens, we're gluttons, just a lot of the things that you see propped up in the media and on films and television. But I think that's like anybody, when somebody's different than you get to know somebody, you're like, oh, you're actually a lot like I am. Okay. Because we're all chasing the same things in life. We're we're all following God in some way. Typically, we're all trying to have a job and support a family and live life and just do all the things. So even if we're from different cultures, we often find we have way more in common than we assumed when we're just looking at each other across the street, so to speak. In terms of 10 years of service, I'm just curious, is that a normal length? Is that 10 years when you hit burnout, or just, I don't know. I've never asked that question about somebody who was in the CIA.
So, I think for us, 10 years, so this is the post 9/11. Joseph and I had a very difficult career within the CIA, meaning, war zone, dangerous location after dangerous location. So 10 years was absolutely exhausting. So you're serving undercover. It feels like you're on the edge of the world because, of course, back then we didn't have, digital connectivity, the ability to pick up a phone and, WhatsApp your family. We just didn't have that. So we really lived a very hard life for 10 years. So those were 5 overseas assignments. I'm allowed to mention that Baghdad was one of them. The rest are secret, but imagine they're a lot of the places that are coming up in your headlines these days. And I think probably the hardest thing about that was, okay, so everyone's like, oh, you're undercover. Did your cover ever get blown? It was actually the opposite. Walking around with a white face like mine in the places that we lived in, we were all assumed to be CIA. So essentially, you're walking around with a big target, on your back. Everyone assumes you're up to something. Everyone assumes you're a spy, and you have to work around that. So 10 years, very challenging, very difficult, often dangerous, and we survived.
And I would assume, wrapping up a career in the CIA might be a lot like somebody who's coming out of serving in the military, where what do you do after you've had this very specific and special skill set, and now you're going to go to try to make a living in out in the normal world, so to speak. I'm being intentional because the answer to that question ties into why you wrote this book. But how do you go about like finding a way to support yourself after you've worked for the government for so many years?
It is so difficult. Making a transition out of the CIA or the military is very much like, you're going to laugh, getting out of prison. Like, I can imagine what someone who has spent, many years in the federal penitentiary feels when they come out. Like, you don't know what to do. You don't know how to integrate back into life. But especially in the CIA, because you've been in this weird intelligence bubble for 10 years, you have no resume. You can't tell people what you've done. You have no idea what you're worth, what anyone would pay you, and what in the world would you even do on the outside. So leaving the safety of a government job is probably the most terrifying thing you can do. And it required an enormous leap of faith. So when the Lord said, it's time, you can leave, we did so with like a huge lump in our throat. But, again, having faith that God knew that what was on the other side was going to be good for us. And so it's not easy, but getting off the X, meaning getting out of your comfort zone, is so important if you're going to follow the Lord and his calling in your life.
And in terms of book writing journey as an author and a publishing guy, I'm always curious kind of about the order in which somebody does things. So, what were you trying to accomplish with breaking cover? Was that more telling your story? Because I feel like, we kind of have these writing assignments and we have to get them out of us to move on to the next thing. So why is that where you started? And then, why pivot into this new book?
Yeah. So when I was still in the CIA, I heard the Lord call me to write this book, which is so funny because I am never interested in writing a book. That doesn't sound like fun to me. Like, a lot of people romanticize, oh, I'd always love to write a book. Not me. So when that calling came, I was like, who are you talking to? And the Lord's like, I'm talking to you. And I want you to tell your story. I want you to share what you have learned, because your struggle can be redeemed by sharing that with other people to encourage them to have faith in me, and also the resilience. So resilience and perseverance is a theme that you will see throughout my 2 books. So Breaking Cover was a memoir, and the Lord's like, I want you to tell your story. So even though it's a memoir, it is set for readers and listeners to see themselves in my story. If the Lord can take me from such humble, simple beginnings and throw me into the CIA when I was so naive and ignorant and didn't know anything about the world, like the Lord can take you to places that you don't even know exist to do the things you were meant to do. Like if people see themselves in Breaking Cover, that was the whole point of that memoir. And it reads like a Hollywood movie. And I'm like, I've had so many readers say, like, I could not put Breaking Cover down. So it was a great inspiration to thousands of people. And then I heard from so many people, you inspired me to Get Off the X, which is one of the chapter titles in Breaking Cover, which is about getting out of your comfort zone. But I don't know how to do that. Like, what does that actually mean in real life? Like, how do I take these steps to get out of this personal or comfort, comfortable area? How do I get unstuck? And so that's what led to the second book, which just came out, Get Off the X. How do you get unstuck? How do you push yourself forward? Because we all know life is hard. The road is littered with obstacles and difficulties, and you need some encouragement and methodologies to like push past that stuff.
Well, I'll say again, as a publishing guy, the fact that people were riveted by a memoir is amazing. I mean, so when I think memoir, I'm like, oh man, it's going to be boring, and where is it going to go? So that speaks to both your writing, and you probably had a good editor that you worked with to put that together. So I love that. And then anytime readers come back to you and are so inspired, where they're like, this is what we really want you to write next. I love that because you have a built-in audience. You've already blessed them with something, and they're like, but I don't know how to do this. And so I love that they actually help to define what they really wanted to see you put together next. Let's go back to that theme of get off the X. Like give us an example of maybe what that looked like operationally for you when you were in the CIA. You share stories about that in the book. And then just for the average person on the street who's just a normal man or woman, what are some of the X's they have to try to get off of in their lives?
Yeah, so Get Off the X is a phrase that we use in intelligence, military, law enforcement, which teaches you how to react if you're under attack by a cartel or a terrorist or a criminal, as counter ambush training. So the idea is to train our brains to not freeze when we're under massive stress and to fight that freeze response. So fight or flight, but don't freeze. And so as the government was we went through tradecraft training in the CIA. Then we had to go through this Get Off the X training in order to, survive all these crazy places we were being sent to after 9/11, war zones and such. And thank God, thank God for that training, because our first assignment was to a place where there was a lot of carjacking and kidnappings. And you would be taken as a target of opportunity by like a tribesman who said, like, wow, look at the white person over there, very valuable. And they would kidnap you, sell you to Al Qaeda, and then there would be a video on the internet of your head getting cut off. And so my husband and I told each other, you can never get taken. You have to do whatever you can to get off the X, because your best chance of survival is to move. So if you're in your car, you got to drive off the X. But if your car has been disabled, you've got to get out and flee. And so we said, it's better to get shot in the back fleeing than to see what happens next. So I really, thankfully, it got embedded in me, that training. I had to use that in my first tour. And this crazy stories in Breaking Cover, it's like everybody's favorite story. But I was able to get out of a potential carjacking, kidnapping situation that was terrifying. I reacted properly, got off the X. And I realized, Shaun, my goodness, not only is this a helpful phrase to stay alive, but it's also a really helpful phrase for life. Like the X is where we get stuck in our comfort zone. And how often do we stay where we are because it takes a lot of energy to move yourself off the X? Like we're created to conserve energy as humans. It takes extra energy and strategy to move. And I realized, my goodness, this is like a perfect phrase to use in to help people to get unstuck. And the things that I think hold people back, I've kind of narrowed it down to fear, because we know fear is a very powerful motivator. Uncertainty, like you simply don't know what to do, so you just do nothing. Intimidation, I think I know what I'm supposed to do, but I don't know that I can do that. I'm intimidated by it. And then finally, the other thing that can, besides these mindsets that are very limiting, are circumstances can throw you on the X, things that are outside your control. So whether that is divorce, the death of a loved one, getting a disease, job loss, unexpectedly, suddenly losing your job, which is happening to a lot of people in Washington, D.C. right now. There's a lot of things, circumstances that can throw you onto the X of like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do next. So this book speaks specifically to those things.
And in terms of whether because I'm thinking like in an operational sense, there's usually you're usually responding to what we would consider foundation shifting events. You have to move, and I assume the skill sets are different. But if we contrast, the foundation shifting event of loss of a job, loss of a loved one, divorce, like we have to adjust. Like I feel like we can choose to sit there, but we have to keep moving forward in some way and have some normalcy. Like you can't avoid it. Versus if you don't have any foundation shifting events, you're going to have to overcome more of the fear, anxiety of like, so if we contrast those two situations, are the things that get us moving the same, or is there some differentiation there? Because, one, you can't avoid it, in my opinion. The other, you could sit there a long time before you get yourself to move an inch.
Yeah. So the thing is to be intentional. I know we hear that word a lot, and it's the same if you're carrying out a CIA operation and you have to get off that X, or if it's just, normal life. The idea is, and the methodologies, they're so simple, yet they're so powerful. And the first one is like to recognize what's got us stuck on the X. Why are we there? What's keeping us there? And then we have to come up with a strategy to move. And so in the book, we come up with like, things like the baby steps, do something. Because I think this culture, social media has fed us this narrative, like you've got to find the perfect next step. And then if you don't find a hack, it's not worth doing. But I'm basically saying, actually, energy begets energy. Any kind of forward momentum begets further progress or develops further progress. So it's not waiting for the perfect. It's moving through the imperfect starts, because just a little bit of energy in the right direction gets you moving. And that's often enough. And it's it's so simple, yet quite elusive to us. You should wake up every day and say, what can I do today to get off this X? No matter how small, no matter how big, do something.
Yeah, I think we all have a propensity to want that easy button, magical one-step solution that just fixes everything. And often the path is a lot less sexy, so to speak. It is these baby steps. I was listening to a podcast with Jocko Willink yesterday, and he was just talking about if you want to get in shape and you can't do a pull-up, hang a pull-up bar in your house and just hang on it day by day, and you'll slowly get stronger. You can't run the marathon on day one. You probably have to just start by walking around the block. And I think it's just that willingness to embrace baby steps, even though the momentum feels small and tiny at first. And but I don't remember if this was in your book, or I read way too many books. But somebody was saying about, in terms of when we're making changes like that, like we think nobody notices or nobody cares. The people around us really do notice when we're making incremental changes. They just might not say anything. So even if we're not getting a reinforcement, like we know we're making a difference in changing. So just, be willing to do the baby steps, because it takes baby steps to get to the big steps. I think in terms of like major life transitions, like I've walked through major career changes. I've walked through losing a spouse and getting remarried and all these different things. But I feel like one of the challenges we face in big change, no matter what, can be this idea of imposter syndrome. Especially, I feel like if you're going towards higher opportunities in your career path or different things, where we still feel like we're the same person we were sometimes when we filled out that first job application and we had no experience. Yet we may have this amazing body of work, but we feel like we're still that college graduate way back 20 years ago. how do we get past the imposter syndrome and keep moving forward?
It's the funniest thing, right? Like these things that hang in our heads that that tell us that we're imposters, parading as an intelligence officer in the CIA. Like, who do you think you are? You're from a small town. You were not primed from birth to be a spy. Um, what I learned moving to DC with all the type A personalities, as contrasted to that more small town humility culture, was that you had, and again, they say fake it till you make it, but it really is true. You have to step forward with that courage that says, well, I might not be enough, but if God opened the door, then he thinks I'm enough. So I had to really hang my hat on that, Shaun. I have no idea if I have what it takes to be an intelligence officer working undercover in the field. No clue. Even after training, made it through tradecraft training. They're culling people all along the way that can't handle the stress, can't make decisions on the fly, can't plan good operations. Made it through all that. Still have no idea if life in the field, like if I'm up to it. But God opened that door. So I have to have faith that he knows better than I what I'm capable of. And so what I discovered, and it took years in the CIA, wasn't until my third tour. And again, that's more a story from Breaking Cover. When I finally had my first terrorist debrief, and I was this thing I'd been prevented as a female from doing to run an operation with an actual terrorist. I finally got in front of that guy. And it was a life-altering moment when I brought to bear all the skills that I had been building for years. And not only did I break through this barrier with this guy who thinks as a female that I'm an idiot and I should never even leave the house without my head uncovered or without a male escort, I was able to change his mind about who I was. I was able to show him I was intelligent. And then I was able to run an amazing meeting to get intelligence out of him he had held back. And then I finally realized, I was like, oh my gosh, all this time I thought I was maybe mediocre, when in fact, I'm actually awesome. I'm really good at this job. And who knew? Only God knew. One of my giftings is that I can engage with bad people, terrorists and insurgents, and I'm really good at it. And I can get them to give me stuff they won't give anyone else. And then it was just a turning point. I thought, my God, all this imposter syndrome for what? Carrying this burden on my shoulder that I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. And all along, I had everything I needed, but God needed me to hang in there long enough for me to develop these skills. So I always tell people, you cannot give up too soon. Like you have to, again, that theme of perseverance, which I weave into both books, it's going to take a long time before you see the fruits of your hard work, your willingness to do hard things, all the suffering involved, and then the redemption of all that on the other end when you see what God does with it. You've got to hang in there.
Well, I want to pull a little bit more on that thread of perseverance. Like, what do we do when we've taken lots of baby steps? Like, we'll just use this as a concrete example. Like, you want to do something new in your career, so you start applying for different jobs, you start networking and talking to people, but you're 90 days in and you're like, I've met a bunch of people, but I'm right back where we started, or right back where I started. How do you keep like investigating your options when things aren't moving? Like, what can we do to kind of get off that place of, because we're actually making progress, but we still feel like we're stuck?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. There's the methodology of dreaming big. Like, what's some crazy thing you can go after? Some crazy position, some crazy job that you're like, that's ridiculous. For me, that was applying to an Ivy League school to get a master's degree in contemporary Arab studies, Georgetown. I got in. For me, it was applying to the CIA. I got in. Like for my sister, who is a 16-year-old unwed mother, it was getting a PhD and applying to Google, which was one of the most sought after positions. I wrote her into the book because she's the master of taking these big, crazy steps and then seeing them happen. Okay, so you try the baby steps, you try the big things. Now, and through all of that, you probe. You keep putting your probe out there and you keep asking people questions. You keep and networking. You keep saying like, what other jobs should I consider? You're always probing and little baby steps, big crazy things. You keep doing that until a door opens, and it's exhausting, and it will take longer than you think it should. And you keep going. And in the middle of that, when you're frustrated, when you're burnt out, because you will be, you have to center yourself on the Lord. You have to say that I know this will happen at the right time, but in those moments, I call them the horrible in betweens. You have to keep that faith that you are moving in the right direction. It's just that the right door hasn't been presented to you yet, or the timing isn't right. So it's persevering through the dreaded in betweens that's going to get you there.
Yeah, we don't love the time in the liminal spaces or in the valleys, but that's just part of life. Often big, exciting, gigantic transitions, they don't just come in a moment. Like it's you look back and you'll be like, that was a long, weird journey to get here, but it's worth it. So definitely keep persevering. I think the next thing I'd love to have you talk to, and you share some stories in the book. We're in a culture where early achievement is just valued and prized and encouraged. And apparently, if we didn't all, if on Google or Facebook in college we failed, why is it okay to be a late bloomer? Because like you share some stories about people who are afraid to go back to school and all these different things because it's just it felt abnormal or weird because of circumstances. So is there hope for late bloomers?
Oh, yes, I'm a late bloomer. Yeah, using my own story as an example. I'm just not one of those that rises quickly or easily. Everything for me is like a climb up the mountain. I am such a late bloomer. I always have been. Um, and I'm fascinated by this cultural assumption that if you don't rise quickly or rise fast, forget it. You might as well just hang it up. Like, I don't know, God specializes in the late blooming. We have so many stories in the Bible. Think of Abraham and Sarah. There are key, Jesus's ministry, 30, it wasn't 18 or 22. Like, there's so many examples in the Bible. And my cousin is a great example. I have weaved stories of people in my orbit into this book that have just inspired this. They're amazing. And my cousin, who was trapped in a really toxic marriage, needed to get out of the marriage, didn't know how, didn't have the money, couldn't support herself, realized that she probably needed to go to nursing school. But who goes to nursing school at the age of 40, right? And she didn't even like school, and she wasn't even good at studying. And then she saw a meme one day in social media that said, whether or not it wasn't nursing school, but it was like, whether or not you go to nursing school, in 4 years, you're still going to be 44. I mean, like, yeah, and you're going to be 44 and you're going to have a nursing degree and you're going to be able to stand on your own 2 feet and you're going to be able to get out of this abusive, toxic relationship. And she did it. And the thing is, like, it's never too late.
Yeah, time moves on regardless of the actions we take. So if there's something that would take you 2, 3, 4 years, time's going to move regardless of whether you take some concrete steps to move in that direction. So maybe take a chance. You never know what might happen. One of the concepts I liked from the book is you talk about behavioral activation, which you say sometimes in terms of if we're depressed or stuck or in a weird place, it might do more than therapy or medication. So behavioral activation, what is that? How can we put that to use in different circumstances or situations?
Yeah, I love this concept because it's the opposite of how we think things are supposed to work in life. So if you take, being physically fit and working out, there's an idea that, man, I can't do it because I am exhausted every day. And what you don't realize is you, exhausted or not, you put your workout clothes on, you walk in the gym and you say, you know what, just walk half a mile or just walk around the block. I feel exhausted, but I'm just going to walk. And then you get walking and you're like, oh, you know what? Actually, I feel better. And then next thing you know, you're running on the treadmill or you're running around the block. So you don't wait for the energy, you act for the energy to come. And so you don't wait for the faith, you act, even if you're not feeling it, right? and then that again, that energy begets more energy, and you create a space for something to happen. The Lord, there's a lot of people think, that these things, these amazing things that happen to you in your life just fall out of heaven into your lap. You just boom. That's not how it works. It's that behavioral activation. You've taken these steps through the pain, through the difficulty, through the imposter syndrome, and then eventually the door opens. It requires those little movements.
I enjoyed in the latter part of the book when you're getting more into kind of the activation part of your teaching. You kind of summed up some of the things that you taught us in the first part of the book as a kind of, okay, this is your arsenal, this is your tool belt kind of a thing. And let's run through those one more time, and maybe give us an example again of how somebody can apply that. So let's start with inertia breakers. Tell us about that part of the tool belt.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just a step further from what we were just talking about, which is um, getting started is the hardest part. Breaking inertia requires a lot of energy, no matter what it is, no matter what you're doing. And so sometimes it's the dumbest thing, So for Narina applying to nursing school, the dumbest thing held her back is like, I have to fill out the financial aid form. And for some reason in your head, you think that's going to kill you. And she just finally said, okay, just sit down and just do it. So that tiny little inertia breaker was the thing that actually got her the scholarship that enabled her to go back to college. It's just that, it's breaking that inertia that, and you're like, wow, I built that all up in my head and made a molehill, made a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah, I think with a lot of those things where there's some specific concrete step that we're refusing to take, it's really a fear of failure, because if they turn me down, I will have, and we have to get past that. And I know in one of the stories you were sharing in the book, you were sharing what must have been going through the person, said like, well, I didn't die, kind of a thing. Like you get out there and you do it, it's like, okay, they didn't laugh me off the stage or whatever it might be. We just have these weird irrational fears of massive failure or humiliation, and unless something strange happens, 99% of the time, that's not going to be the result. Let's go
Yeah,
to
I
the.
mean, you
Go
ask
ahead.
the question, like, what is the worst that can happen? And I don't know if it's who I am or as a result of being in the CIA, but I always ask that question, what's the worst thing that can happen? And it's usually not a life and death situation, though in the agency, then we learn to plan for it. Like, so the worst thing that could potentially happen is A, B, C, D, and E. So this is a really interesting methodology here from the CIA, which is plan for what if I lose my job? What if this happens? I'm going to have to save money. You actually plan for the worst case scenario. And that, I mean, it helps you to take control of a situation that feels as if you have no control. So planning for the worst case enables you to move forward.
All right, let's get to that next tool in the tool belt, and you've talked about this some already. The probe, is that just putting feelers out there or pushing in some different directions than where you've been going?
It's trying different things. Yeah, it's trying. Maybe I'm supposed to look at this particular industry. Maybe I'm supposed to look at this particular project. Maybe I'm supposed to look at this. It's probing. It's saying, oh, and then you try it and you're like, no, that's not my thing. Or, no, that doesn't tap into my skill set. Okay, let's try this other thing. It is, it's like looking at life like an intelligence officer. It's going out there and collecting the intelligence to see what shakes out, what will work for me, and what's terrible. There's so many things that were really helpful to me before I got into the CIA and I was probing all these potential career options. You know, a lot of the wisdom was knowing what I wasn't good at and what I would never do. I'm like, oh, okay, well, we'll take that one off the table.
And next, let's move on to power moves. Is this dreaming and going after big ridiculous things, or is it taking action that is just gonna give you a big leap forward? Like what's the
All
definition
the
of a power
above.
move?
Power move is saying what is a crazy thing that I can do right now. What is some thing that I think is unachievable, but if I don't try it, I'll never know if it was possible. And again, what's the worst thing that can happen? You make a power move, you apply to a position, you apply to a particular job, you try, a side hustle to see if that might work. Um, you try, and sometimes the power moves actually do work. A lot of times they don't. And so what's the worst thing? They don't work.
And then the fourth tool in the tool belt, I don't think we've talked about this yet. Controlled detonation. What is, I get what that might look like operationally. What would that look like in normal life situations?
Yeah, so controlled detonations are when there is a very real obstacle in your path, not a self limitation or an obstacle from your own mind. So this is something very real. Like I cannot move forward until I figure out childcare options for my children as I look for additional education or a better job opportunity. Like this is the thing I have to conquer. And so you do it. You go straight into it. You stop trying to like march around it, be scared of it. Like, I just don't know how this is going to work out. And you start exploring your options because at the end of the day, this is an obstacle you've got to get rid of. You've got to, detonate in the field, right? Detonate the IED before someone runs over it and loses a limb. So as Americans, we tend to have a fear of these things and we avoid them. We placate them. We dance around them. Like, just stop doing it. Figure out, go straight at it. And a lot of times, what I think we find in so doing is that the obstacle wasn't as intransigent as we thought. And you're like, oh my gosh, geez, that was easier than I thought. And in my husband's situation, he's like the master of controlled detonations. But I love his story because here we are in Baghdad in the worst part of the war, and the US government is saying we've got to find a way to engage these insurgents who are killing us and killing other Iraqis. And my husband ended up saying, why don't I contact the head of the insurgent group? He's a former close confidant of Osama bin Laden. And everyone's like, what? You're going to pick up the phone and call the terror leader? Because, that's how a lot of them end up being bombed by locating their telephone and locating where they're at. And my husband is like, well, I mean, why don't I try? And the crazy thing is, this gamble of calling a senior terror leader ended up working. It's a little bit of a long story how that actually ended up lining up. But that big gamble, that controlled detonation of that terror leader, because his word stood. So if he said we're going to stop attacking coalition forces, that whole group was going to lay down its weapons. So that obstacle, that terror leader, that senior insurgent was really critical to fighting back against Al Qaeda and bringing stability to the Sunni areas of Iraq. And it worked. Like, this crazy, stupid, ridiculous thing worked and had immediate ramifications on our safety. And, it cut down on the IEDs and the sniping of our soldiers and all kinds of terrible things in the field. So again, we tend to get so scared of these things. And in the end of the day, my husband had one powerful conversation with the guy, like one, and it worked.
And in terms of kind of reader takeaway from the book, or how you hope your readers are changed, and maybe we'll put this in the context of solo journey versus, I know in the latter part of the book you talk about maybe getting a group of people together to like work through some of these concepts collectively and collaboratively. Like, how would you like to see maybe individuals and groups use this content to make a difference in their lives?
So, as we know, if you want to be successful and have purpose and meaning in your life, you surround yourself with people who are seeking and have achieved the same thing, right? What we learned when we were planning counterterrorism operations in the CIA was really good ideas were generated when a lot of officers came together to say, okay, we need to get at these senior insurgent or terror leaders. How do we do this? And so you had young officers, mid-career officers, senior officers, you had case officers, you had targeting officers, you had all different kinds of jobs and skill levels all in one room. And we would just ideate, brainstorm, how can we achieve X, Y, and Z against the terrorists? And my goodness, when you get all these brains together, really fascinating things come out. And I thought, Well, this is a very simple but powerful strategy we can use outside the CIA, where you can say, hey, have you ever thought of this? Have you ever considered this approach? Have you ever thought about the fact that you could be really good at this? The idea of floating your dreams, goals, objectives with other people that you trust, they might have considered something you never thought of, and it's actually a hack. Like, there aren't a lot of hacks, but they'll be like, you can find the real life hacks in situations like that, or the really good ideas, or something you'd never considered. So the power of the ops group, which is what I call it, what we call it in the CIA, the power of an ops group can really help change your life and help you get off the X.
I think too, just the structure of if you have a group and you're meeting regularly, whether that's weekly or bi-weekly, whatever that looks like with your schedule, just knowing that you have to get up in front of a group of people, talk about progress you've made or what you've done since the last meeting. I feel like that's a fail safe most of us need to make sure we can fit this change we're trying to implement into our already busy lives. We all have way too much to do. And sometimes the simple act of participating with a group will help you stay on assignment versus if you're just trying to do this when you already don't even have a free hour in most of your work days, it's just not going to happen. So maybe use that as a fail safe to make sure you actually start moving in a direction, planning and implementing the change that you'd like to see happen. Michele, in terms of us connecting with you, finding out more about this book, your previous book, where do we find you on the web?
Yeah, so it's my 3-part name, MicheleRigbyAssad.com. If you can't remember that, if you just plug in Michele and CIA, you'll probably find it. Michele with 1 L. And it's a very robust website. So you can learn about the books, you can learn about my speaking engagements, my consulting, and a little bit of inspiration in there.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to Michele's website, as well as places where you can pick up your very own copy of her brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Michele Rigby Assad. Once again, our book today was Get Off the X, CIA Secrets for Conquering Obstacles and Achieving Your Life's Mission. And Michele, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It was fun.